Hey everybody, hope you're having a great day. It's another morning and just wanted to do a video that I'm pretty excited about actually. So this one is, I don't really know where to start, but I guess the motivation for this video was watching a video with Alex O'Connor. I think that's his name. Maybe I got that wrong. Alex O'Connor. He's a pretty popular YouTuber, and he's the Cosmic Skeptic online. And there's a video that Jubilee did of him debating like a bunch of Christians, and so he had. I didn't watch the whole thing. I just watched the beginning of it, but plan on watching the whole thing here soon. But I didn't really have time. One of his arguments was, basically he just makes a claim. He sits in the middle of the room, and then everybody around him comes up and one at a time and presents arguments for the faith. Jubilee's done other videos like this, but anyways, he had a couple different arguments against God's existence, and one of his arguments was that the existence of suffering in the world makes God's existence unlikely, something like that, which is honestly I think it's one of the hardest objections that we can come against as Christians. And it's one of those things where, like, if you are talking to somebody who's experienced suffering, or like there's no way to explain why the suffering had to occur, and I think there's really good answers in the Word. There's, like, God has the answers, and for me, like, I've struggled with this a little bit, but I haven't really, it's never been like an insurmountable thing for me. And honestly, like, I really respect, like, I don't really respect the objection to like God's character and why he allows suffering, but I do respect that Cosmic Skeptic was very neutral on the question. He says, I'm not saying this makes it impossible for God to exist. He's just saying, I think that it makes his existence more unlikely. And he's just kind of saying that's his opinion and that's his claim, and everybody has the opportunity to come and argue it, or argue against it. And these are probably very, very intelligent Christians who were selected as good, good competition to come up and debate Cosmic Skeptic. But he's a formidable guy, and yeah, and my cat is meowing at me out the door, so that's okay. Anyways, so my crack at it is going to be in this video. So, like, where do I start? I guess the basic statement that God is sovereign over history is a good place to start. And why would I start there? So I'm going to ask you, like, let's just do a quick pop quiz. So the first question, if you get out your pen and paper, what is Einstein's famous theory? That's the first question. Second question is, what is Isaac Newton's famous theory? And the third question is, who invented the atomic bomb? All right, so if you got those answers to the questions, yeah, this might not make any sense, but this is my chance at taking a swing at the old suffering argument. So, the reason for suffering that Christians describe is the fall of man. Fall of man brought about sin, brought about death, brought about evil, brought about suffering. And when we see suffering and death, whether it's between human beings or between animals, or just it's all a part of entropy, of creation. And it says this in Romans chapter 8. The creation itself was subjected to futility. Not willingly, but he who subjected it to that futility, God, subjected it in hope. And so, as Christians, we're aware that suffering exists. We can't always explain why it exists, but that there's a hope beyond this suffering. It's expressed in the proverb, the light of righteousness is like the first gleam of dawn, shining ever brighter until the full day sun. So those who see the first gleam of dawn are still seeing a lot of darkness, right? But there's a hope there. And that hope is demonstrated in Christ's resurrection. And God's made promises to his people that there's a day that's coming where there's no more suffering. And the suffering in the world has come through pain, or through sin. Suffering and pain has come through sin, not that suffering is always a result of sin. Like the Bible refutes that. People suffer who are not, they're not suffering for results of their sins, or suffering as punishments always. Job's a great example of that. I did a video on Job explaining this very thing. Job suffered, as far as the Bible is concerned, more than any other human being. And he was a picture of suffering. And his friends were very smart men, smart theologians, and they had been trained to think of suffering as a sign of punishment for sin. And so they, after commiserating with Job and comforting him for a week and just being his friends, they started to wonder, why is this happening, and guessing why this happens. So Job was a picture, like he bore the marks of a cursed person, and he bore this suffering. But as you know, if you read the book of Job, there's more going on behind the scenes of the story. So going back to my 3 questions. The first was, Einstein's theory was the theory of relativity. So if you said that, you got that answer correct. The second answer was, for Newton, it was the theory of gravitation. So you got the answer correct. And then the third gosh, I'm struggling here. All right, well, I should have planned this more. The third was Oppenheimer created the nuclear bomb. So I'm not sure how accurate the movie about Oppenheimer was, but there's a really interesting scene at the beginning. I've only seen it once, but this was the most interesting part of the movie for me. So at the start, like, Oppenheimer's going a little bit crazy. He's it says, you know, it's kind of talking about the beginning of the story. He was in college, and you know, he was starting to have these visions of like a hidden universe, he said, and he's a little bit out there, a little bit different, right? And he gets made fun of in his school, and he actually goes up and tries to, he gets ready to kill his professor with poison. He poisons an apple and sets it on the professor's desk, presumably for the professor to eat, and then he leaves. And I think it's the next day he wakes up suddenly and rushes into the classroom, and another man who is one of his mentors, who later becomes one of his mentors, is about to eat the apple. I'm sorry, some of you might be way more familiar with the story, but you know what I'm getting at. He's about to eat the apple. They're having a conversation about theoretical physics, and he goes to take a bite of the apple, and Oppenheimer grabs the apple and says, "Wormhole." And I just thought that was brilliant. So I don't know if that actually happened, but let's just, for the sake of this argument, say that it happened. So he says wormhole, and obviously wormhole is, like, if you're looking into cosmology and physics, the wormhole is like this idea of, you know, that's how a wormhole can go from one different place in space to another place in space, and you know, it can transport you. And I don't know if it's the same thing for time as well, if there's a wormhole, and that's like the most probable way that time travel could happen. So it's just interesting that he said wormhole, grabs an apple, because worms dig into apples and eat them, and you don't want to eat an apple with a worm in it. So it's like a clever play on words. So whether he really did that is something, but the idea is that he had like went back in time and grabbed the apple and you know, prevented himself from murdering this man. And it was, the timing of it was, if he had woken up 2 minutes later, this mentor would have eaten the apple and got really sick or died or something. And then what would have happened if Oppenheimer went to jail for murder? The atomic bomb wouldn't have been created, right? And so it's interesting. That's all I'm saying. And so, and then the second question was, I guess I'm moving backwards here. The second question was, what was the theory, or what was the theory that Newton created? And that's the theory of gravitation. So he observed it by watching an apple fall from a tree, or so the story goes, right? So there you have two stories of apples. I'm just using this as a clever example of how if one thing didn't take place, another thing wouldn't have happened too. And so, if Oppenheimer had hit snooze on his alarm, maybe the history of the world would have been changed. Now, I don't want to say these things to paralyze people with meaning, but people have problems with God because suffering exists. And the answer, I can understand why the answer, suffering exists for a purpose, doesn't always give you a clear answer, but you can see why it would exist for that purpose. So basically, God knows the end from the beginning, and He knows the path, that we have to walk, and He charts out our path before us. And that's the idea of like following God, is that even though there's suffering in our life, through that suffering, we're delivered in hope into a perfect end, right? So, or we fall victim to sorrow with those sufferings with no hope. And so the idea of this apple idea is the idea of the fall of man is the reason for suffering. And without that fall, there wouldn't have been suffering. But through the fall, the world was subjected to suffering. But that suffering is in hope. And, the idea of, like, because Oppenheimer was, he had prevented that murder from taking place, he wasn't guilty of murder. But he created the atomic bomb. And now we have mountains of fire, and we had a Cold War, and we dropped a bomb on Hiroshima. I'm not saying Oppenheimer himself is responsible for all those things, but there's just a cause and a reaction. So then the first question was, what's the theory that Einstein created? That's the theory of relativity. And that's the idea that basically light bends and refracts around objects. And so it changes the way, I don't know exactly what the theory is. I'm not going to pretend to be smart and know what it's about, but it's interesting, certainly interesting to me, that relativity is also the competing theory for how we derive our morality, the theory of relativity. Or moral relativity is how we build our morals. If there's no God, if morality is an absolute, then we have moral relativity. So it's just interesting. I don't think that means too much there. But the idea in Oppenheimer is expressed. Oppenheimer knew Albert Einstein. And one of the things, one of the problems with the atom bomb was that there was a slight chance that there would be a chain reaction that would destroy the world with the atom bomb. And at the end of Oppenheimer, sorry for the spoilers in this movie, I should put a note in the title that there's spoilers to Oppenheimer in this movie, but the atom, when the atom bomb went off, Oppenheimer feared that chain reaction happened in a different way, that he triggered a chain reaction. And it's an interesting moment when he's talking to Einstein, and they're like standing by water and looking at ripples in the water, and he's like, I fear that there's a chain reaction that we have started, and it's gonna bring about the end of the world. And so, Oppenheimer, the whole movie, he's like deeply troubled about all of this. And so the idea is, one of the ideas against suffering is also, I think at the core of this objection, it comes to an objection against God's nature, against his judgment. And so the people who have this objection to suffering, they're asking, why would a good God allow this suffering to exist? and they don't always realize what they're doing. And sometimes that motivation to ask that question can be okay, whether it's just for the sake of argument or it's like a gotcha. It is, it is what it is basically, but the objection can come from a judgment against God, right? Like, why did God allow Joshua to kill, Israel to kill this town? Well, God knew the end from the beginning. Just like I asked, what would happen if Oppenheimer set his alarm later? His professor would have died, something different would have happened, a different outcome, which God would have known about. And God essentially is sovereign over the world, and he's sovereign over history. And so these judgments we see God make, we don't often understand, if God didn't make the judgment, what the outcome would otherwise be. But we can see God's reaction, where sometimes he judges people or even nations, whether they're like the entire nation, whether it's the animals that live in the nation, the men or the women or the children. And what we don't understand is, if God had made another decision, what would the outcome be? And it's very likely that God would know the outcome of that. And so I think God's given us, my personal opinion about this, and I could be wrong, but my personal opinion about this is that God gives pictures, not just in the word, but in our history, and he gives us words and signs to show that he is sovereign over history. And he allows us to see that he is in control, and he does make judgments, and he does intervene at times, like with Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm sure there were women and children in Sodom who were killed, and of course the story is that God wasn't able to find anyone righteous in the whole land, including children. And do I know the whole story? No, and I don't have to. But I do know, hey, if God didn't make that decision to do that, what would the outcome be? What would have happened 100 years down the line to Israel, or 1,000 years down the line to the entire world? If God it's interesting, it says in the New Testament that, or I think it's in Isaiah, gosh, I'm sorry, I'm struggling with this video, but I think my argument's still standing. But the vine was the vine of Sodom. So the idea of a vine is that it grows and it produces fruit, right? So Jesus says he is the true vine, and if you abide in him, you'll produce fruit. If you don't abide in him, you won't produce fruit. But there's this other vine that produces a bad fruit, and God says it's the vine of Sodom, right? And so the idea is that this vine, if God didn't cut the vine off, would have produced fruit, and that fruit would have impacted the world in a way that God had foreseen, and therefore God had intervened in history. And so anyways, I'm going to cut it off here. Let me know if this was helpful to you as you think through this question. The question doesn't bother me, but I'm fairly certain that I would not be able to always answer it for somebody like Cosmic Skeptic, who has this question, and this is like their biggest objection to God's existence. And neither do I think we need to answer that question. I think that the people who ask it sometimes have to ask themselves the question is, where does this question originate from? And why is it so insurmountable for me? And then another follow-up question to that is, if this question was to be adequately answered, not necessarily to answer the question and settle it once for all for everybody, but to settle it in the heart of the person who's asking, would that be the catalyst for faith? Or would there be a follow-up objection and a follow-up objection and a follow-up objection? And at the core of that, where does that originate? Yeah, so anyways, those are where I would leave everybody with. Anyways, thanks so much for your time. Bye.